Maybe because when you're kids, you don't see the obstacles. And maybe that's a good thing.
Robin, once again, is not a person who would say, oh, I love my brothers.
We didn't feel competing, we felt influenced. More than competing.
Robin is incredible. They don't make people like Robin anymore.
I'm just a BG on my own at the moment.
There was a moment when one of them stopped talking. Not publicly, not dramatically, just quietly. A phone that stopped ringing. A voice that wasn't heard again. At least not the same way. And the strange thing is, almost no one noticed when it did. Because by then, the damage had already happened. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. The story didn't begin with anger. That's what makes it harder to trace. There was no screaming match caught on tape. No final argument fans could point to and say, that's when it broke. Instead, it began with something far more dangerous. Silence. Robin and Maurice had grown up sharing everything. Rooms, stages, melodies, even the spaces between notes. They learned early how to blend their voices so closely that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And for a long time, the world celebrated that closeness. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being seen as strength. No one ever said it out loud. They didn't have to. The industry has a way of enforcing rules without writing them down. Rules about image, about control, about what happens when two people share blood and power. And brothers, especially brothers, were considered unstable ground. At first, it showed up as suggestions, small ones. Maybe one voice should be featured more. Maybe interviews would be easier if one brother spoke for the group. Maybe the public needed a clearer center. Nothing was forced. At least, that's how it looked. But what happened behind closed doors was quieter and far more effective. Maurice was the one who noticed first. Not because he was more sensitive, but because he was the one who kept smoothing things over. He adjusted. He stepped back when needed. He filled the gaps. And for a while, that seemed to work. Robin, on the other hand, didn't adjust the same way. He absorbed things, stored them. There were moments when he would sit through meetings without saying much at all. People mistook that for agreement. It wasn't. But that part wouldn't be understood until much later. What made the situation worse was how invisible it all looked from the outside. On stage, everything sounded perfect. The harmonies still locked together. The performances still earned applause, which led everyone to the wrong conclusion. If it sounds fine, it must be fine. But there was a rule quietly at work, one that had nothing to do with music. Hollywood has always been uneasy with brothers who operate as equals. One brother can be marketed, two brothers can be compared. Compared eventually, one must be elevated. And once that happens, balance becomes suspicion. People begin to watch for cracks. They start asking questions designed to divide. Who's really in charge? Who writes more? Who matters most? Those questions don't just live in interviews. They follow you home. They sit between you in cars, in hotel rooms, in moments that used to feel safe. Robin felt it more intensely than anyone realized. But what's often misunderstood is why. It wasn't ego. It was fear. Fear that something essential was being rewritten without his consent. Fear that the bond he believed was unbreakable was being quietly reframed as a liability. And the cruel part was that no one seemed to think this reframing was cruel at all. It was described as normal, as how things go. Maurice tried to be the bridge. That's the role he naturally fell into. When conversations became tense, he softened them. When decisions leaned too far one way, he tried to steady them. But bridges feel pressure from both sides, and eventually they begin to crack too. There was a particular stretch of time when conversations between the brothers grew. Careful. They spoke about music, about schedules, about work, but they avoided something else, something unnamed. The thing that couldn't be discussed without breaking, the illusion that everything was still intact. Years later, one of them would admit that this avoidance was worse than any argument, because arguments end. Silence doesn't. What made it even more painful was that outsiders kept stepping in to interpret their relationship for them. Producers, executives, journalists, each with their own version of the story. And those versions didn't always match the truth. In some of them, Maurice was painted as the peacemaker. In others, as the one who understood the business. Robin, meanwhile, was increasingly described as difficult, moody, sensitive. No one stopped to ask why sensitivity might be a response, not a flaw. And no one asked how it feels to watch people explain your relationship with your own brother as if you're not in the room. There was a moment, not a public one, when Robin realized something had shifted permanently. Not in the music, in the trust. He didn't say anything at the time. He couldn't, because saying it would have confirmed the very thing he was trying not to believe. Maurice sensed the shift too, but he interpreted it differently. He thought it was a phase, something that would pass once the pressure eased. What neither of them fully understood yet was that the pressure wasn't temporary. It was structural, built into the way the industry handles brothers, especially brothers who refuse to compete. The unspoken rule isn't that brothers can't work together. It's that they can't remain equals forever. Eventually, the system pushes. Gently at first, then harder, until one brother bends or breaks. And the tragedy is that when the breaking happens, it often looks like personal failure, not systemic design. By the time the distance between Robin and Maurice became noticeable, it was already too late to trace back to a single cause. There was no smoking gun, just a trail of moments no one thought were dangerous at the time. A comment brushed off, a decision made for efficiency, a role quietly reassigned, each one small, together irreversible. Near the end of this chapter of their story, there was a phone call that never turned into a conversation. Not because either brother refused to answer, but because neither knew how to say the thing that actually mattered. And what makes that moment so haunting is this. Both of them believed they were protecting the other. They just didn't realize what they were sacrificing in the process. And the truth behind that sacrifice, that's the part that was never meant to be talked about. The distance didn't announce itself. It settled in quietly, not as absence, but as formality. Conversations became precise, careful, polite in a way brothers are never meant to be. What no one outside their circle understood was that the silence wasn't caused by anger. It was caused by restraint. Both Robin and Maurice believed that if they named the fracture, it would become real, so they spoke around it. Instead, Maurice continued doing what he'd always done, absorbing pressure, translating tension, making sure the machine kept running. To the industry, that made him dependable. To Robin, it slowly made him unreachable. And this is where the unspoken rule did its quietest damage. Because Hollywood doesn't just divide brothers by preference, it rewards the one who adapts first. Maurice adapted, not out of ambition, out of love. He believed that keeping things moving forward, even imperfectly, was better than stopping to confront what might tear everything apart. Robin saw something else. He saw a version of their bond being rewritten without his voice. Not loudly, not cruelly, but efficiently, the most dangerous way. There were moments when Robin wanted to say something, to ask a question that hovered just beneath every conversation. When did this stop being ours? But he never asked it, because the answer might have confirmed his worst fear. That equality had quietly expired, and that brotherhood, in the industry's eyes, had an expiration date. What made the pain harder was that Maurice never meant to replace Robin's voice. He believed he was protecting it. He believed he was standing between Robin and forces that didn't care who got hurt, as long as the product stayed intact. But protection, when it's not spoken aloud, can look like erasure. And over time, Robin felt erased, not from the music, from the decisions, from the direction, from the conversations that mattered most. Years later, Robin would acknowledge something he hadn't understood then, that Maurice wasn't choosing the industry over him. He was choosing survival. The problem was that survival required silence, and silence was the one thing Robin couldn't survive. There came a moment, quiet, unrecorded, when Robin finally understood the rule for what it was. Not a punishment, not a conspiracy, but a structural truth. The industry doesn't know what to do with brothers who refuse hierarchy. It needs clarity, a center, a single voice it can negotiate with. And when brothers resist that, when they insist on shared gravity, the system applies pressure until something gives. In their case, what gave was conversation, not immediately, but gradually, until there were thoughts neither brother knew how to share without sounding accusatory, until concern began to sound like criticism, until love began to sound like distance. Maurice carried guilt he never spoke aloud. He worried that by holding things together, he was pulling something apart. Robin carried grief he didn't yet recognize. Grief for a version of brotherhood he believed had already slipped away. And the tragedy is this. Both men believed they were at fault. Neither understood how much of it had been engineered by forces neither controlled. When time began to thin their opportunities to repair what had been left unsaid, something shifted. Not dramatically, but honestly. Maurice became more reflective, more aware of what had been lost in the name of keeping peace. Robin, in turn, began to understand that silence had protected him too, just not in the way he needed. There was no single conversation that healed everything, no cinematic reconciliation, just small moments of recognition, a pause that lingered longer than usual, a look that acknowledged regret without assigning blame, and eventually, acceptance. Acceptance that their bond hadn't been broken by hatred, but by an industry that mistakes closeness for complication, by a system that doesn't trust shared power, by a rule that says brothers must eventually be separated to function. What makes their story so haunting isn't that they drifted apart. It's that they never stopped caring, even when words failed, even when silence filled the space where conversation once lived. Near the end, Robin would speak about Maurice not with bitterness, but with quiet reverence. Not as someone who betrayed him, but as someone who carried too much. And Maurice, in his own way, left behind a truth that doesn't need explanation, that he never stopped listening, even when he didn't know how to respond. The Hollywood rule still exists. It always will. But Robin and Maurice left behind something stronger than the rule itself, a reminder that brotherhood doesn't always fracture in explosions. Sometimes it fades under pressure, and sometimes understanding arrives too late to change the past, but just in time to soften it. And that understanding, that quiet, hard-earned clarity, is what finally brings peace, not to the industry, but to the brothers who survived it. There's one last thing that rarely gets mentioned when people talk about Robin and Maurice. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's uncomfortable. Long after the distance had settled, long after the industry had moved on to newer stories, there were still moments when Robin would pause before answering. Certain questions, not the obvious ones, the quiet ones. Questions about trust, about ownership, about whether things could have gone differently. And every time there was a hesitation, as if he were deciding how much truth the world was allowed to hear. Because here's the part most people miss. The Hollywood rule didn't just change how the brothers worked, it changed how they remembered each other. When you spend years being told, subtly, persistently, that closeness is a problem, you start to reinterpret your own past. You look back and wonder if moments of unity were actually warnings, if loyalty was mistaken for imbalance, if love looked from the outside like weakness. Robin wrestled with that quietly, not in interviews, not on stage, but in the spaces where memory does its most dangerous work. He wondered if speaking up earlier would have saved something, or destroyed it. Maurice, meanwhile, had carried a different weight. The weight of knowing that keeping things stable had come at a cost he never intended. He hadn't chosen sides, but he had chosen continuity. And continuity in that system always favors one voice over another. Neither brother ever said this directly, but it lived between the lines of what they did say. In the way Robin spoke about fairness, not bitterness. In the way Maurice was remembered, not as a strategist, but as a caretaker. And that's the quiet tragedy. The industry framed the story as creative tension, but the truth was emotional displacement. Two brothers adapting to a system that never learned how to hold both of them at once. Even near the end, there were things Robin chose not to clarify, not to protect an image, but to protect a bond that had already endured enough interpretation. Because some truths don't heal when they're explained. They heal when they're respected. And maybe that's the final lesson hidden inside their story. That not every fracture needs an autopsy. That not every silence is failure. Sometimes, silence is what remains when love outlasts language. The Hollywood rule will continue doing what it does. It will keep separating brothers, rewriting partnerships, simplifying stories that were never meant to be simple. But Robin and Maurice left behind something quieter and more human. Proof that even when equality is taken away, even when voices are rearranged, brotherhood doesn't disappear. It just learns how to exist without being seen. And for those who listen closely, it's still there.